So, Mike, I know we kind of like done this like multiple times, and like we pretty much like have a like pretty much a lot of like same like Coach Boo, like Dan Path. So, but still, like, can you introduce yourself a little bit?
Sure. I'm Mike Young, owner and director of performance at Athletic Lab, a sport performance training center in North Carolina. Also work as the director of performance for the North Carolina Courage, women's soccer club, most winningest or most decorated soccer women's soccer club in North American history. I've worked with them full time for the past 8 years. I am passionate about sports science, coaching education, strength and conditioning. My original background, both as an athlete as well as a coach, was in the sport of track and field, which is why we have some connection across Coach Boo and Coach Dan, both of who are my primary influences in terms of my training philosophy. My educational background, I've got a undergrad in exercise physiology, master's in coaching science, and a PhD in uh, biomechanics with a minor in exercise physiology. So I like to dabble a little bit in terms of wearing multiple hats as a coach, as a speed coach, as a sport performance manager, as a business owner, as a coaching educator, and as a sports scientist who's still actively collecting data and in process of doing some things for publication. So like to wear multiple hats and do different things, all surrounding or revolving around high performance sport.
Nice, nice, nice. So, uh, since we basically know a lot of, like the same guys, like I want to start by asking you this, like. Coach Boo and Dan Path kind of like influenced me a lot about like no matter speed training, strength training, or like you mentioned biomechanics. So, uh, what are like the biggest like influence or like biggest takeaway from like those two coaches?
Um, for me, I worked for 4 years for about 4 hours a day with Coach Boo, so it was very extensive experience and tried to pick his brain whenever I could, and was very studious about learning from him, even when he wasn't explicitly teaching. Uh, Really, what I gathered from both of them, but saw firsthand through Boo, was attention to detail and movement quality. So a lot of times people prescribe movements, but they don't pay attention to the finer details of the movement. And when I first started working with Boo, I could very quickly pick up that he was looking at little small things that otherwise people might miss. How you contacted the ground, your time on the ground, how well you amortize through the ankle, knee, and hip. What's your postural alignment? Are you losing posture at contact? How are the limbs switching? How is the coordination of the right and left side, or of the arm swing and the leg swing? So all of these little details that a lot of people miss, especially those people that are oftentimes stuck in a weight room, they don't see with faster movements, more ballistic movements. Uh, Coach Boo and Coach Dan kind of really set me straight that it's important to look at movement everywhere, not just on simple things, but it's much more important to look at it on the larger scale, faster movements. In fact, I'd go so far as to say that a lot of coaches, especially younger coaches or those that don't have a great coaching eye, are really quick to coach the things that matter and mean a lot less. So, for example, many coaches will get really caught up and spend a lot of time on getting the mechanics of a body weight squat or a push up correct. And that's very worthwhile to do, but then they'll let someone go and sprint or do some plyometric activities, and they don't provide the same level of cueing and coaching and attention to detail on the movement standards. And really, if you look at those different movements, whether if we take squats and push-ups on one side, and we take say plyometric bounding and sprinting on the other side, Well, if you do this wrong, if you do the push-ups and the squats wrong, you're probably not going to hurt yourself. You're not going to get the most out of the exercise, but you're not going to hurt yourself. And uh, you know, but if you do this wrong, the sprinting, the bounding, you'll hurt yourself and you won't perform very well. So, and really, this is a lot more relevant to sport performance than body weight squats and push-ups. So, what I was really kind of emphasized, really stressed to me was movement quality matters. It's not just about the exercise prescription, but how well do you move? This is something that I've taken through, since my time at LSU and beyond, applying it to long-term athletic development scenarios and just making sure people are good, efficient movers. I think a lot of times coaches get into this idea of coaching what they're able to see, and really, if we go back to that push-up and squat example, those are slow movements. Those are in place movements. We take a bounding exercise or a sprinting exercise, and the joint velocities are, maybe 20 to 100 times faster than what we might see in a push up or a body weight squat. So, of course, you can coach the push up or body weight squat really easily. It's slow, it's easy to see. It's effectively like watching something in slow motion compared to a sprint. But the sprinting, coaching something fast like a sprint, or even say an Olympic lift or a jumping movement, is much harder. It takes a more acute, finely tuned eye to know what you're seeing. You have to basically be able to see real time in slow motion to be able to figure out what's going on, how to trace back errors, how to determine what needs to be fixed the most, creating a hierarchy of needs, if you will, so that we're fixing the most important things rather than trying to fix everything at the same time. So I'd say of all the things that I picked up, there's obviously the programming mastery and periodization and progressions, but I've seen a lot of people do those things reasonably well, but I've never seen anyone do the attention to detail on movement quality as well as those guys really stressed it to me.
Nice, nice, nice. So, uh, since we were kind of talking about like attention to detail, watching like movements, I want to like start by like I want to ask you a question. Like, um, there's like there's like more and more technology right now, like velocity-based training, force plate, 1080, like motion capture whatsoever. But still, like NFL, NBA, I don't know if that's the same with soccer, but I'm more familiar with NFL and NBA. So there are more and more like Achilles tendon tear and ACL rupture. Like, uh, why do you think that is?
Well, I think it's a pretty complex question with no clear answer, but this is what I would say. On I'd start with the premise that injuries will occur when the load imposed exceeds the capacity of the tissue. So if we start from there and work backwards, we can kind of start to make sense of some of this. So the load imposed could come from several different areas, right? So a lot of times these athletes are bigger, faster, and stronger than we've ever seen before. You have NFL linemen now that are 180 kilos, 400 pounds, in some cases, and they're reasonably fast. You have guys that are wide receivers who are 90 to 100 kilos and almost as fast as a track and field sprinter, having to make very fast rapid changes of direction and also having contact as well. You see the similar type of thing in basketball. In basketball, the average height has increased a little bit. It's and now the game has changed quite a bit. So your bigger players are also very highly skilled players. You have players who are 7 feet tall, 218 meters or so, and um, they're able to do aggressive lateral movements and step back movements and that kind of thing, and they move like the guards of 20 years ago. So with size comes an instability. Size in terms of stature comes instability, right? You're basically a skyscraper relative to someone who is short and closer to the ground. And with mass comes greater momentum, comes greater ground reaction forces at impact, whether that's jumping or change of direction or sprinting. Um, if the speed stayed the same. So when you start to put all that together, that these athletes are probably undergoing experiencing loads, forces with respect to the ground, or in the case of contact, onto each other that exceeds what was probably seen years ago. So that's one side of it. The other side of it, I would say, is that we have moved away from long-term progressions, and we've moved towards uh, earlier specialization, which has there is some need for that, but earlier specialization without being efficient movers. I think you can specialize early, but still build a large movement library and be able to be an efficient mover elsewhere. And then one of the biggest problems I see is that we are uh, we are we have a shorter and shorter off season. So if you if the off season gets shorter, and this is very problematic in soccer, where the off season just keeps getting shorter and shorter. It may be as short as about 4 to 6 weeks, and then you have a 10-month season. If you play in the NBA, you are when you go to mini camp all the way. Let's say you make it to the finals, you have about 10 and a half months, 10 months or so. So now if you take a 2 week transition period and give yourself off for a little bit, that means you only have about 4 weeks to prepare if you played in the Olympics or you played in the finals. So the off season keeps getting shorter. The the competitive season keeps getting longer. I think the NFL wants to move from 16 to 18 games, right? So, um, and so basically what you have is you shorten the preparatory period and you lengthen the competitive period. And even though it's just a small change, the ratio shifts pretty dramatically. So it's already unfavorable to because you're competing for, something like a 10-to-1 ratio. But now if we shift that even more by taking an extra 2 weeks out of the, say, competitive or the rest period, the transition period, and putting it onto the competitive period. Now, of course, you're going to get more injuries, and I think this is where you're seeing that the the capacity of the tissue gets overwhelmed. So even if the load stayed the same, the load imposed stayed the same, if the capacity of the tissue doesn't have the chance to prepare adequately, and that comes from training, then your likelihood for injury will go up. We can increase the capacity of the tissue quite well, but it takes training. But the issue is that if you're playing to perform at a high level, as you might be in the NBA or the NFL or in pro level soccer, if you're playing to perform at a high level, you can't be always training to get better. And if what you're doing is you're training to maintain at best, right? So if you're only training to maintain and never training to get better, especially if you don't take advantage of small breaks in the season, like an All-Star break or an international break, like a FIBA break or a FIFA break, then the likelihood of you getting hurt is quite high. And what we're like in the past couple of years, we've seen a lot of Achilles injuries in the NFL in the preseason in the first 1 or 2 weeks. So what this is telling me is it's very similar to what happened during the COVID period. In the COVID period, we would have a lot of athletes who went on all the pro teams went on the leagues went on a break. They didn't play, they didn't train for anywhere between 3 to 9 months. And then all of a sudden they came back and they started to resume play. And when they did, athletes were getting hurt all the time. And it's because their capacity had reduced to such a level that we, even if we were implying the same load, that capacity, their capacity was reduced, so they got hurt. But what's ended up happening in the NFL now is you got guys that are big, fast, and strong. They haven't maybe lost their capacity to produce force all that much, but their tolerance to repeated loads over time, maybe some unusual positions, uh, is a little bit less than it was before. So it takes them it takes them some time to build up tolerance. And if they're exposed to a potentially injurious situation in those first 3 weeks, 4 weeks of the season, then um, they're at a high likelihood for injury. So really, it's definitely a multifactorial thing. I mean, we have more sports science being thrown at injury prevention, more load management being thrown at these athletes as ever before. And then I'd point out one thing here when it comes to load management. I think it's been both a blessing and a curse. I'm all in on load management, but I do come from individual sport background, meaning track and field. I coached and competed in Olympic weightlifting. Um, I even did some swimming back in the day and have coached some high level swimmers. These are sports where load management almost doesn't even exist. You just train hard pretty much all the time. Your rest days are pretty hard days. They're just you're switching the physical capacity emphasis from maybe a neuromuscular emphasis to a metabolic emphasis and then back again. And you're just alternating these means and methods of training on a day-to-day basis so that you're kind of training at a relatively high level all the time. It's very common for, say, a track and field athlete to train 2.5 to 3 hours per day for 6 days a week. That's pretty standard. You rarely see that in team sports. And so that what I'm getting at here is that the capacity of the human body to adapt to a load is very high, very, very high. But if we're using load management only to reduce training load, we're in trouble because you don't have the training stress to build up the tolerance. So with my uh, women's soccer club, we train very hard. I think I've seen some of the training loads that other teams do. Familiar with the training loads for men. It's very widely known what's shown in the research literature. Women, it's much less known, but I have seen some of the training data over several years of the women's league, both here in Spain and in the United Kingdom. And our training load as a team tends to be anywhere between 20 to 50% higher than what most women's teams do, and higher than even a lot of the men's teams that you see in the research data. And the way that we accomplish this, however, is by incremental progressive overload over extended periods of time. And that's something that would be really familiar to someone that's worked in a sport like swimming, weightlifting, or track and field. You don't have to start off at a really high training load. But and there's nothing wrong with a really high training load. I think some team sports say, "Oh, you're training so hard." Uh, that's not right. You look at some of the NBA teams that are doing load management, and part of what they're using load management for is just taking guys out of games or taking, letting your star players skip practice. Well, what that does is it basically reduces their tolerance to load because they don't have the stress necessary to create the adaptations to to adapt to a high training load. I'm a big Michael Jordan fan. He's my goat, as he should be for everyone. And you look at Michael Jordan and you say, this guy, along with several others, he's not completely unique, but this guy played 82 games for most of his career. Even when he was 40 years old, he had an 82 game season. And now, if a guy plays 70 games, he's like a miracle worker. It's almost unheard of to play 82 games. So this is a guy who's playing 40 minutes a game or so at 82 games of the season. And this was somewhat common, but somewhat common. It wasn't completely out of the ordinary back then. And this is before all of the weight training, really took hold, certainly before load management and daily or weekly jump testing. And, what I think part of that comes down to the fact that, hey, if we look at load management as a way of not just reducing load, but also training to the point of their tolerance, then they can tolerate a little bit more. So my philosophy in terms of load management is train to bend but not break. So we will train them to be able to tolerate a really high load so that when that load is imposed on them, whether that's in a game or wherever else, that it is beneath their capacity. And when the load imposed is beneath the capacity, tissue capacity, then the likelihood for injury goes down. And we've tracked data over the past 8 years. Our ACL data is a fraction of what it should be per hour in women's sporting world. In women's soccer, it's pretty well documented what the ACL likelihood is in terms of our exposures of practice, and ours is a quarter of what has been documented in the research literature. So um, I think there's something to just simply training more to develop, uh, as long as it's within a planned progressive overload, incrementally implemented over extended periods of time. I think that's how you build injury resiliency. Again, it's multifactorial, correct movement, make sure the athlete has a big movement library. But a big thing that has been missing, I think, in my opinion, of recent is that people don't train as hard as they used to. It's almost looked down upon if you train really, really hard, as if you're not doing something correct.
Nice. I also like you brought up like Michael Jordan or like the game at 80s or 90s is way different. And although I kind of disagree with you, like I think Kobe are better, but like it's okay. But I do like you brought up like how those guys like the game at 80s and 90s are brutal. And they
Yeah,
played like 82 games with like 40 that is just brutal.
yeah.
So so, and I actually talked to like Derek Hansen like a few days before, and he also mentioned that nowadays we tend what like we our training is more towards like output metrics. We didn't really prepare them or like build the capacity for our athletes. So man, I like where we're going. I like this. I like this.
Good, good.
So, besides like tissue tolerance or like load management, the way you explain load management, that was awesome. But besides like load management or like tissue tolerance, um, like how about like the injury mechanics? Can you like kind of explain like I know this is also a big one, a broad one, like, but can you start like kind of explain like like Achilles tendon rupture, like what are the mechanics when it happens?
I think with a lot of Achilles tendon tends to be a little bit specific, right? So it seems to happen a lot of times when the Achilles is either out of position. So there's not, I mean, the Achilles tendon, the fiber is largely aligned to do one thing: generate uh, elasticity in a linear fashion. So if the Achilles gets out of position, like there's torsion on it, the Achilles doesn't operate very efficiently. Now, a lot of change of direction type sports, that is going to be a factor, right? We're curvilinear running, we're changing direction, we're jumping up and down, we're getting hit from the side, that kind of thing. But a common denominator that it seems to occur with the Achilles is that it's placed on stretch. So when you see the Achilles tend to rupture on step backs more than anything else, I think. So like step backs or the initial acceleration or on a jump landing sometimes. And it's because the Achilles tendon is placed on a very rapid stretch. And I think that's no more so on say like a false step or a step back or on a jab step before we start to accelerate forward because the heel will drop. The ankle is dorsiflexed, so the joint is already in a position of great flexion. The calf, the gastroc, is attempting to shorten. Um, the Achilles is being forced to lengthen, and that's when you tend to see these ruptures. I've just recently read that it's not always when you'd think it would be. It's not always in the most aggressive type of loading. So there is likely some chronic loading issue that comes into play here, where we get into a scenario where the tissue reaches its last straw. But with every Achilles that I have seen, it's been the Achilles is under stretch while being stretched while attempting to shorten. Um, and we're basically, that's a similar phenomenon to what we see in late swing phase with a hamstring. And if we're lengthening a tendon, if the tendon is lengthening and under load on both sides, it's it's problematic, I guess. Um, in terms of why we see it more often, again, I think we got bigger, faster guys that are able to push a little bit harder on that first step. I don't think it's like any mystery. That's a huge load on that tendon there. It is a very resilient tendon, but it is a that's kind of a what would you say a high exposure to be lengthened in a lengthened position while attempting to shorten.
Yeah, nice, nice. Because uh Adam actually did a paper on like a lot of like NBA Achilles tendon rupture, and just like you mentioned, it's most of the time it's like the fall step or like the jab step, and it's actually like deep dorsiflexion and
Yeah.
then eversion, inversion for the ankle. Just like
Right. So the yeah, I mean, if you look at the design of the Achilles, it's really just meant to move in one direction, right? So we get that eversion inversion, and it's like you're pulling on a rope in a direction, off of the pulley. Um, but it may be Adam's work that I'm actually referencing here. I think I've seen one or two papers on it, but now that you say that, I do remember Adam Peway's paper. That is one of the ones where I've seen that it's not always that it occurs most often in that jab step or the false step, um, which is I think a step that you almost have to do if you want to accelerate fast forward. So there's not a lot of way around it other than building tissue tolerance in that.
nice, nice. I like it. So that's for Achilles tendon rupture. How about I know ACL is like a lot complicated. So, but still, like, can you explain a little about like the ACL rupture mechanics when it happens? I know this is it, like a really huge one, but
Yeah, so this is a really big one, and I work in women's soccer, so it is extremely problematic. As I said, we actually track it pretty deeply, pretty tightly, and I try to ensure that we take pride in the fact that we stay well below the expected injury frequency relative to 100 or 1,000 hours of exposure of play. Um, so, with regards to ACL, it is incredibly multifactorial. There are several different research projects that are ongoing with it. I'm in early stage of uh, one right now where we're trying to look at it. But I mean, there's you hear many, many things, and it seems like nothing is conclusive. So I would by no means consider myself an expert on this, but here's what I do know. Uh, One of the factors would be Q angle. Some people say it matters. Some people say it doesn't matter. Just from a purely structural standpoint, if we were to look at things from a biomechanics and physics loading, you would say that a large Q angle seems as if it is structurally unsound or structurally more likely to lead to ACL injuries. So women tend to have a higher Q angle. Hormonal profile or your where you sit in your menstrual cycle at a given point in time can be a factor. Um, but again, inconclusive. It seems like there are certain points of the menstrual cycle where there's a greater likelihood for soft tissue injuries than others. Again, not really well understood. We do some monitoring of uh, menstrual cycle, body temperature. We really prefer body temperature because it's a more accurate proxy of where someone is in their body temperature. So we take body temperature by an Oura ring, um, and then we're doing your typical morning wellness surveys, which are a really nice provide insight into where someone sits and how they're affected by their menstrual cycle or other stresses that might be going on in their life. Um, Strength seems to be a really big one, in particular, hamstring strength. The hamstring uh, provides stability, redundancy, and ensures that the tibia doesn't glide forward too much. So it can help preserve the ACL. And then there's also some research that suggests that women don't move as well as men, in particular on jumping activities. So uh, if you teach a woman or a female how to land, whether that's sprinting or jumping, with the mechanics of a male, that they will reduce their likelihood for ACL injuries. And the thought is that boys are exposed to sport earlier, they gain a larger movement library, they're maybe more inherently efficient at jumping and landing because of the reduced Q angle and maybe some maturity issues. And but if we were to uh, focus on movement quality and try to teach women how to absorb force, how to maintain postural alignment at contact, how to keep ankle, knee, hip alignment, that we can reduce the likelihood of ACL injuries. So these are all kinds of things that I try to incorporate into my training. We do, especially with women, we're doing some pretty extensive traditional, what might be considered max strength type exposures to these soccer players, more so than I hear many other teams do. We're incorporating some form of plyometrics into their training on a very regular basis. Maybe it's pretty much part of the warm up about 3 or 5 days of the week, 3 or 4 or 5 days of the week. Again, emphasis on landing mechanics. We're doing bilateral, we're doing unilateral, we're doing lateral movements, backward movements, forward movements, drop and depth jump type movements, all for that same effect of hopefully reducing the likelihood of injury by exposing them to exposing them to loads, but also exposing them to an opportunity to enhance their landing mechanics in hopes that we can reduce the likelihood for injury. I mean, I think a lot of people don't load well enough. Whether that's in plyometrics or in the weight room, and with women in particular, I think you can really have a significant impact on their likelihood for injury if you just get them very strong and very powerful. Uh, because the training that it takes to become very strong and very powerful creates a tissue resiliency that allows them to to be less likely to have a ACL or MCL or any other kind of CL tear knee type injury. We had a couple issues this year that when you look at the video, you're like, wow, those players, two in particular I can think of, those two players, they should have had their knee blown out. The positions they were in was really ugly. It was not something that you'd ever want to see someone in. Thankfully, both of them, however, were not. They missed time from 2 to 6 weeks, but neither case required any kind of surgical intervention. Both of them had their knees intact. One of them had uh, one had an MCL and an LCL, and the other one had an MCL. And really, you'd think that if you looked at these positions, that they should have probably had an ACL. And then last year, to be fair, we had two ACL tears in 1 year. It's the only time I've ever had two in one season. Uh, Both of them were contact related. So there are some things that you can't control when these injuries are contact related. All you can do is make someone best prepared to be able to handle that contact. And again, I think a lot of that comes down to make the tissue as strong and resilient as possible. If we're dealing with you know, very low grade, not very strong, not very resilient soft tissue, that the likelihood for injury just goes way up.
Nice, nice. So, uh, so if we just talk about like the mechanics of like injury, so it's basically like the acute angle you mentioned, or the is it called anterior glide of the tibia?
Yep.
So for women, actually like just getting them bigger, stronger, and faster actually will help. What about like for men's, like maybe NFL and NBA players?
So yeah, I think things stay really similar. It's those players tend to not have the same issues. Like NFL players, a lot of their ACL issues come when they've been hit hard, or their knee is in a very awkward position. Now, the sport of um, basketball and football, you're almost always going to be at some point in a very awkward position with your knee. Uh, I think if you think back to classic loading in the weight room, it's oftentimes drilled into you to make sure the ankle, knee, and hip are in alignment. Make sure that we never go into valgus or varus, or the ankle joint is always neutral and dorsiflex and never excessive eversion and inversion. But then you see in sport, these things happen all the time. So I think it's very important to have some form of controlled exposure to these unusual, awkward positions, so that when they are inevitably exposed to them in games, that it's not their first time seeing this. If you can expose them to these types of positions under manageable loads in training, then I think that's how you can build these tolerances. I remember when I was going through exercise physiology programs and taking exercise prescription type classes and learning different stretches and different, you know, movement techniques in the weight room. A lot of times it was very robotic, and we had entire classes on what you'd call contraindicated exercises or contraindicated movements. Don't ever do a hurdle stretch because it places too much stress on the knee joint. Uh, don't ever go valgus with the knees when you squat or when you jump because it places too much stress on the LCL. Uh, you know, all of these kinds of things, while very well intentioned, may have inevitably been exposing individuals to a higher likelihood for injury, especially athletes, because when they were inevitably exposed to these positions in sport under much greater loads than they would ever see in these controlled training environments, they had never seen it before. Their body had never seen it. So it became a recipe for disaster there was zero tissue tolerance. So I think there is some benefit to actually training in these unusual, awkward, disadvantageous positions, as long as you're doing so in a way that is controlled and progressive. So you don't necessarily go right into these very aggressive, fast, high load movements in awkward positions. But if you were to expose someone to them in very slow, controlled loading fashion, and then gradually ramp up the load, gradually ramp up the velocity of the loading, now you're going to have a gain tissue tolerance to a much greater extent. I think my family is actually Jamaican, and I went to Jamaica when I was young, and I remember seeing some really individual things. Uh, and one of the things I remember seeing as a kid was the these limbo champions. So these people that could compete in limbo. So this is where you go under a very low bar. There's people that can limbo so well that they can go under a car. So that's how low they are. 30 centimeters. They can pass their entire body with only their feet on the ground under a car, under a 30-centimeter bar. It's wild to see it. And the the positions that they have to get into to do that are just amazing. They're going I don't even know what incredible internal rotation of the hip, the gnias valgus. They're on the big toe or the inside of the foot. Incredible inversion of the foot. So they're basically in these positions which is contraindicated at the ankle, the knee, and the hip, and they're creating a huge load because they're backward leaning on this, and then they're effectively doing like this mini jump. And you see, wow, these guys, they don't get hurt doing this. They're in some pretty incredible positions. Uh, and this is a great example of, if you expose the tissue to something gradually over extended periods of time, it can tolerate it. No, almost, we don't know what the limits are really. I mean, the human body, I like to say, is this incredibly adaptable machine. Um, it can adapt to cold stress, heat stress. It can adapt to get stronger, to get more powerful, to add muscle mass. It can adapt. You can get bone growth thanks to Wolff's law. If I just hit my head with a hammer like this, my skull is going to get bigger right here. So we respond to stress by becoming, as long as the stress is not too excessive, we respond to that stress by adapting to be better able to handle it. So if we know these stresses occur, this varus, valgus, contact positions, weird eversion, inversion type positions in your sport, you pretty much should be exposing them to those positions in your training as well.
Nice, nice. I love it. I love it. I sorry I put it into a hard position to answer like these like really bar question. So
Yeah.
yeah. So since we're talking about like these injury, it happens a lot with like change of direction or like deceleration. Um, can you share like your thoughts on like change of direction movements, like how you categorize like change of direction? Because I know like some people will say it's like crossover and like shuffle, and I know like Lee Taft said it's like a lateral run and shuffle, like or like there's like drop step. Can you like kind of share your thoughts on like how would you categorize like the change of direction?
So I think Lee is fantastic, great guy, and I like a lot of his ideas. What I'd say is that my progression is probably a little bit different, but I tend to look at change of direction in all dimensions. So many people think of change of direction as only moving laterally, or turning 180 laterally, or straight and then cutting backwards. I think we have to look at change of direction all of the ways it occurs in sport. So that's lateral, that's forward to backward, that's backward to forward, that's up to down, that's up to sideways. If you compete in a sport like volleyball or basketball, you jump and then you start to run in one direction. You might go forward and backward, and now you have such a high prevalence of things like the step back, which is basically the most like one of the most aggressive decelerations that you could see in sport. When you see these 6'6" guys, 7 foot guys do a step back that's covering almost a meter and a half or something like that. That's a tremendous amount of deceleration and acceleration, a huge change of direction. So you got to figure out what is a change of direction that's occurring in your sport. Make sure that your training addresses that. Um, in terms of the mechanics, I think we want to have enough of an efficient movement library that we can achieve the same task with multiple different strategies. That way, we are movement flexible, not flexible in terms of the touching your toes or uh, enhancing muscular flexibility, but flexibility in terms of the movement strategy that we have. And then in terms of my progression, what I would look at, so we've got all of these different potential movement options, up to down, down to left, down to right, backward to forward, forward to backward, 180 turns, 90-degree turns, all of these different options. And then what you do is I think of it in terms of the mechanics. So as I said, I'm a biomechanist by trade, and I look at it in terms of the loading. And where does the loading come from? It comes from uh, mass times velocity, right? So and since mass is really not changing unless we're getting hit by someone, that the faster that you're changing direction, that's one of the key variables. Like if you're moving in one direction very fast and you have to redirect, then if you're doing that same redirection at the same angle, but at a faster velocity, it's a higher load. Velocity is load when it comes to athletic type movements. Um, so things like how long did you have to accelerate? How aggressively were you accelerating? And then that would be one factor. What is the speed you're bringing into the change of direction? What is the angle of change of direction? So if we think of your potential change of direction on a circle or a 360-degree arc, you could be moving in this direction and then cut right back. You could be moving in this direction and then change direction on just a slight angle, or here and then cut at a 90, or here and then cut back 45 degrees back. So all of those have loading uh, different loading on the body. And then once we cross-reference that with how fast are you moving into those different angles of departure, we see that we can get a pretty clear picture on what is the most demanding on the body. So when you think of like the step back, as I mentioned, you're moving in this direction, and then on a single leg, you push directly back. Really, really demanding on the body. If we look at a lot of other sports, uh, let's say a crossover in basketball, or a step over in soccer, or kind of like a shimmy juke kind of thing in a football, we see it's like a step in one direction and then we cut back the other. Demanding, but not as it's more of it's an easier change of direction, oftentimes at a lower velocity. Um, and then let's not forget the fact that really sprinting and jumping of any kind is a change of direction, right? I'm looking laterally here, I'm sprinting, I'm in the air, I'm coming down, I hit the ground, I have to change direction up in the air. If I'm doing a vertical jump, if let's say I'm a volleyball player, I have every time I jump and I land and jump again, that's a change of direction. I've come down and then I've gone back up again. So change of direction occurs in all planes. We need to address it, make sure it's touched on in our training in all different ways, in a way that is matching what we see in the sport, and then kind of looking at how do we have a wide movement library? Are we progressing with velocity? and addressing the different potential changes of departure angle out of that. Um, and I think that's how I'd kind of look at it. There are for sure mechanically correct ways of changing direction. Um, lower the base of support, get the foot outside of the center of mass. These are kind of basic concepts of biomechanics and physics, but there's not one correct way. There are several movement strategies that would work to achieve an end goal. And in an ideal scenario, the athlete would have comfort performing many of these different movement strategies and not just revert to one. I think your extreme example would be if an athlete has to move in this direction and then cut back, and they always plant on the left leg to make their 180-degree turn. Now they're very limited. They don't have a broad movement library at all. Uh, we're at a greater risk of having issues, right? We are overloading that left leg, perhaps. We're also come into some match or game negative consequences because if I'm always turning on my left leg, it means I'm always turning towards my right, which means if I'm on the right side of the court, I'm not seeing the court when I make my turn, right? So we sometimes see athletes who, maybe only make their turns on one side. So we try with our GPS loading, we try to look and see, do we have basic step balance? Do we turn to the side roughly equivalently? Um, because those kinds of things can for sure lead to issues down the line.
Nice, nice. I love it. I love it. So, um, does that mean like if I want to summarize this, does that mean like you probably won't necessarily like teach like just crossover or shuffle? Like you won't narrow into like such a like just two ways, but like there's different way. You kind of coach them or like ask them to do the task and give them like different scenarios, different variability of movement. But at the end, just let the athlete figure out like what they want to do on the court.
Yes and no. So what I would start with is my general framework would be both. This is true both for a long-term athletic development scenario where we're starting with young kids and progressing over time, but also with, uh, let's say, over the course of a season where we start the season, we might expose them to very constrained skills. So that crossover step is great. Using cones and having to just focus on the physical technique and capacities associated with agility uh, would be useful. And then as we progress, what we do is we start to remove the constraints, start to introduce some chaos, whether that is the incorporating a ball, incorporating other players that you need to respond to, changing the field dimensions, removing the cones and adding maybe external cues, whether that's visual or auditory, and then seeing what the strategy is. I do generally like to design the programming so that we're getting exposure equally to right and left side. So sometimes I will make sure that we're at least have that level of a constraint. So perhaps it might be, hey, we're always going to turn when you have to turn, you're always going to turn to see the field, or you're always going to turn towards the gate or the wall. So I might put those kinds of constraints on there just to force them to uh, have some competency both on the right and left side, because otherwise some athletes may always choose their dominant side to go towards. But I think there's a time and a place for these very constrained drills. I think it's a great place to start, and I will almost always incorporate them even throughout the year. But as the year progresses, as an athlete's career progresses, I would suggest you move into less constrained movements, sometimes even forcing them to figure out different movement strategies to accomplish a goal rather than putting limitations on them.
Nice, nice. I love it. I love it. I sorry I put you into like hard position to answer like those like really, really broad questions. But for those who are interested in what we're talking about today, or for those who are interested, I know like you mentioned you train like track athletes, pro basketball player, soccer. And you do post a lot of like great content on your Instagram. So, and Athletic Lab. So for those who are interested in your like online education or like in-person education, where can they find you?
So I've put a lot of content out there for free, as you can as you've mentioned. I've been a big advocate of coaching education and a product of coaching education. So I probably have a couple dozen lectures available for free online. Many of my presentation slideshows are available for free. I've lectured for almost all of the big national governing bodies, and they host videos for me as well as some private organizations. I do have a coaching education platform myself, in addition to my own lecturing and speaking engagements and consulting. I put together Athletic Lab Academy a couple of years back. It is actually built on a lot of the very people that we spoke about. Much of my information from Dan and from Boo and from guys like Ethan Reeve and really smart guys like that I've worked with over time and picked up a lot of things from. Tried to distill the best of that, put it into our coaching academy, which is a 3-tier coaching education platform. We have the first tier that is available online in English. We're working on it in Spanish and Portuguese. And then we have level 2 and level 3, which are a little bit more immersive courses, which are available in person. But uh, whether you buy in for these courses or not, make sure you level up on your coaching education. It's a continuing process that should never end. And guys like you are doing a great job spreading the word in terms of having great guests and highlighting different training philosophies. So appreciate your work in the field as well, Eric.
Thank you. Thank you. Love it.